Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's session, Set Your Agribusiness Transaction Up for Success. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now that we have our housekeeping items out of the way, I would like to introduce today's presenters, Aaron Martinez and David Kavanaugh, both in the merger management practice here at Moss Adams. And now, Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. It's a great topic we're going to have today. And just a brief background on myself, I specialize in doing all forms of merger acquisitions, carve-outs, joint ventures, strategic alliances. And our conversation today will really hinge on how to think about your integration strategy. So before we get too far, Dave, you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. Aaron, thanks very much. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dave Kavanaugh. I'm a senior manager in the merger management practice. And like Aaron, I have quite a bit of experience in the M&A field. And my experience is both from a consulting perspective, about 15 years there, and then about 14 years in industry doing M&A work on behalf of the company that I used to work for. And looking forward to chatting with you all in more detail.
Great. So let's just review the objectives for today. So there's 4 major areas that we want to go through. One is just talk about M&A strategies. Why is it so hard? What's so difficult about it? Why some firms succeed and some don't? We can go through some of the tactical steps of what's really involved with the integration process. It's a pretty complicated step, and if you coordinate it correctly, you'll have good results. And if you miss a piece or two, then we'll talk to you about how to remediate those things. We'll talk a little bit about governance and accountability, which is really an underpinning of how successful transactions occur. And then I'll go through a short description of a case study, and you can understand how these things are applied in practice. So, Amy, we've got a polling question already.
All right, thank you. So our first polling question is, are you contemplating a transaction? A, already underway. B, close to signing a deal. C, plan to acquire in the next 6 to 12 months. Or D, still integrating the last acquisition. And we will give you a few minutes to respond. To respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose and make sure you hit that submit button. And if you can't see the submit button, you will need to enlarge the slide area.
It'll be interesting to see the results. There's been a lot of activity in the M&A space right now, and especially in agriculture. There's a lot of demand, a lot of consolidation. So let's see what it looks like.
All right, we'll leave it up another 5 seconds here.
Okay.
Okay, here are the results.
All right, this is interesting. Still integrating the last acquisition.
Yep.
Got the pull lead, and then plan to acquire in the next 6 to 12 months. All right, this is great. So this is a good context for what we're going to talk about here, and I'll keep that in mind because there's some things we want to talk about in terms of early planning, and then how do you actually get through the integration process itself. So let's slide forward here. You know, when we think about what is really the challenge with acquiring another business, you know, you've got some things that you like about another business. There's some attractive features in terms of their product, their service, maybe their customer base and their market. But really when you break it down is, you know, how do you go about delivering all of that expectation, whether it's growth, it's strategy, it's synergies. There's a number of different elements in terms of what you're actually trying to accomplish. But at the same time, you also think about how do you treat your employees, the new employees that are coming into the business? How do you ensure that you don't lose any customers? How can you grow your market share with your existing customers? How do you handle your vendors, your growers, other suppliers? Those are all part of the equation here. And then at the same time, you're also trying to build what the platform is going to look like going forward. It's going to change. You're going to acquire a business, you're going to change your method of operation, you're going to change your operating model, you're going to change your go-to-market strategy, whatever it happens to be. Now, how do you start building that in the context of delivering the benefits, taking care of your employees and your growers? And now, how do you do all of that without really negatively impacting the current business? And this is why M&A is really quite difficult. There's a lot of things that can distract you. There's a lot of emphasis on just trying to get the deal done. There's a lot of work that has to be done with the integration. For those who are already in the middle of it, you understand what I'm talking about here. And those that are about to undertake this, just keep this in mind. This is extremely important in terms of why it's so complex.
So building on what Aaron said, we see some differences between what we call successful acquirers who meet their deal objectives and those that fall short. And the common themes for those who fall short is, we'd almost say, an over-focus on three things: the initial offer, the due diligence, and then the close of the transaction. And what we see is that successful acquirers, instead, they manage the entire M&A value chain, starting with developing the M&A strategy, which actually supports the overall corporate strategy. But, you know, when we look at number one, let's really simplify it. What we're talking about is not complex strategy. We're talking about what are the goals and objectives of the transaction? What are we trying to achieve? And what capabilities does the target have that we're looking to bring in-house? And so the other aspects of the strategy might be, how are we building market share? How are we moving into new markets, et cetera? From the development of the strategy, the deal synergies really is, in the life cycle, it's just a quantification of what those goals and objectives are. So if we say moving into new markets, well, then what's the expected revenue growth associated with the transaction? Or if we've got an opportunity to improve our margins, are there, let's say, supply chain enhancements that might drive some of that? But it gets to quantifying what are these goals and objectives that we're driving toward. Let me pause a bit on diligence. And again, I said up front, this is where there's an almost over-focus for companies that in some cases have challenges. And in certain clients that we have, they really see diligence as, number one, absolutely linked to the strategy of the deal synergies, but they see it as their first deep window into the target. And when I say that, understanding the target's capabilities in more depth, understanding their culture, understanding their operating model, and then understanding some of the challenges and strengths that they have just through the management conversations. And then last but not least, there's the focus on the historical financials and the quality of earnings. From these first 3 points, we move into integration planning. And again, the linkage we want to drive home is that integration planning, it comes from the strategy and the synergies. It prioritizes, where do we focus first? We've got very limited resources. We want to move very, very quickly. So let's focus on the things that are most impactful for driving what we say is the expected deal thesis, which, when I say deal thesis, to us, it's the combination of the M&A strategy and the synergies. And then last but not least, and here's another tripping point for us, is the execution. The reality is that deals are hard, as Aaron said, and there's a lot of time invested by senior management to get the deal teed up, go through diligence, and move through close. And as a result, there can be a tendency toward this kind of falling off the radar for executives. In fact, this is really the time when we need to flip and really begin to focus. So for companies that are very successful, there's a very, very tight management around the integration. And I'd also say an expanded visibility. And what I mean by that is good acquirers are very transparent within their organization about how the integration is progressing. Is it on track versus off? Are there issues that we're wrestling with? And we've even seen techniques even down to the level of right after post-close, adjusting your financial statements to build in the capability for tracking synergies. And on a monthly basis, how are we doing budget versus actual? And that way, it, again, keeps the visibility, but it also drives a bit of accountability. Aaron, you want to go from there?
Yeah, so let's talk about what could hold you up. So here's what we commonly see in terms of the pitfalls that most companies go through in terms of driving the value. You'll hear a lot of studies out there that talk about 70%, 80% of deals don't deliver the value that was intended. In part, that is because there's two streams of activity that are actually going on when you're talking about an acquisition. If you look on the left-hand side with transaction team, this is typically a very small number of folks. This could be an owner, a CEO, a president, maybe the CFO, and some other legal representatives and your accountants, and right? You have a small team working on this, but there's a high amount of time and focus on understanding the business that they want to acquire. And there's so much intense focus on that often there's a drop-off in terms of what about the integration? Is it going to even cost me much money? How long will it take? The complexity around that. That's a big, you think it might be so obvious, but yet it's one that gets commonly missed. Everybody's trying to get the transaction done. They're running to close. In reality, they're running to the starting line. It only begins there. So the first point of caution is make sure that when you're thinking about your diligence process and you're setting your strategy and you're going through the close process, start thinking as early as you can about integration. It doesn't mean you need to bring the army of people in to help you do the integration, but start thinking about what are the issues that we're uncovering in our diligence process. What are some of the other strategic things we said we wanted to accomplish with growth, markets, customers? How do we start thinking about that in an integrated context in putting these companies together? Cost is a big element of this. There's a lot of one-time costs you're going to have to deal with. Some of these things that Dave mentioned are synergies, and those go away, but it also takes time and effort to put it in place, what the new operating model is going to look like. And so there's some cost there. And there's a host of complexities with regard to people, relationships with third parties, customers, growers, et cetera, that also need to be factored in here. So the line, from the low to the high on the right-hand side with the integration team, that team needs to start ramping up as you start progressing to close, and if you know you're actually going to go through with it. The other part of this is you don't want to bring a whole army of people in when you're not going to go through the transaction. So that's why you keep it small. But that's the rub. That's the tension behind moving fast, deliberately, bringing people along at the right time, right cadence. The other misstep here is around the team is brought in too late. The information is not handed over. They don't understand the full strategy about why we're doing this to begin with. The executive team, that core team, they've been looking at this for 3 months, 6 months, even a year or two. It's really clear in their mind in terms of all the different aspects of how it could happen. But when you start bringing integration teams, if you don't start bringing them up with a full understanding of the strategy, what the objective is in the end state, they're not going to be in solid footing, and you're going to be a little bit late. You're going to be making poor decisions because you're not having complete information. So that's probably the second biggest risk there. And the third one around the execution risk is, what is the plan? Again, we're racing to the starting point of let's get the deal closed, but do you actually have a plan to grow revenue, to consolidate functions, to expand capabilities, enhance capabilities? That has to be very clear, very deliberate as part of the planning process. And the sooner you get started with that, the more clear the plan looks like on day one moving forward, the better off you're going to be. It's those companies that don't put the time and effort into it and decide after closing, oh, we need to do something, and change is already happening. Now the clock is working against you. So I would say that's probably one of the, in terms of the typical cycle and things that have commonly occurred, these are the areas that you really want to be, be careful of. Mm-hmm. So let's just talk briefly and set the context in terms of how this deal cycle works. So when you're thinking about an acquisition, you should be thinking well ahead of what your capability gaps are. Where do you think there's opportunities in the market or with your customers that you can't get to today with an organic strategy? And why do you think an M&A might fill that need? That needs to be a lot of effort, a lot of thinking around how that's going to work. Who are good targets? And we can talk, in a different webcast in terms of how do you qualify a good target? Once you have that set, that sets the foundation then for everything else that takes place after that. And it's really important to have that defined, written down, put it on a wall, put it in cement, so that you can come back to and say, at any point in time in your deal cycle, are we still meeting the objectives that we set out for ourselves? And I say that only because you can fall in love with a deal, and it might turn out to be a bad deal, but if you don't have something to ground you to come back to say, this was our starting point in our strategy, it'll be difficult for you to kind of make that work correctly. As you progress, you're going to get to a letter of intent stage, and that's the agreement that you're going to have with the target company that says we want to continue to move this forward in a more deliberate way and committing to a certain time frame to complete our diligence with the intent of closing this deal with you. And that can vary. It can be 4 weeks, it can be 6 weeks, it can be 8 weeks, it can be a certain amount of time. But keep in mind that's wall time. If it's a 45-day exclusivity, you have all of that time to get your legal diligence done, your financial, your tax, your operational diligence done. You're pressure testing your synergy assumptions in terms of how this is actually going to be accretive once it goes to closing. So you have to plan this out almost as aggressively as you do the rest of it in terms of the integration plan. Once you get to signing, now you're kind of on that upward trajectory of the curve I just mentioned about getting integration teams involved. They probably have been involved when you're talking about some of the operational diligence at this point, but now you're thinking, how do we actually get the deal closed? But then more importantly, what is the plan? We think about it in two ways. We talk about, day one and post-close. Day one are all the things you need to have in place to make sure the company starts looking and feeling like one company. Maybe you made some early decisions on employees, leadership positions. Maybe there's some basics around email and calendaring and some other things to make sure you can work effectively together. Those are all the things you want to start thinking about in this sign to close period. And then, of course, after close, integration can take 3 months, 6 months, 2 years. It could take quite a long time depending on what you're actually trying to do. And again, if you're going after growth, which is typically why you want to do this, there's going to be a lot of thinking, and maybe you have to restructure your sales organization, your mode of go-to-market methods, how you're treating your employees. Do you even have the right people? A lot of decisions need to be made in this. We'll talk about this more in just a moment. But this is the broad life cycle of what an integration can look like. So it's not something that you call a team in on day one and all of a sudden there's a sprinkling of dust and it makes it work. It is deliberate from the point you decide you think you need to acquire a business versus growing things organically, and continue to pressure test your assumptions around the deal strategy and then wrapping up any integration. Okay? So let's just talk a little bit about, next polling question, Amy.
All right, thank you, Aaron. So the second polling question is, what's your motive to acquire another company? A, grow existing market share. B, enter new markets. C, product diversification. Or D, expand talent pool. And while you're responding, I just want to let you know that you do have the option to submit questions for the presenters. You would use the Q&A window in your console. We have quite a bit of content to cover today, but our plan is to have time towards the end to try and address some of your questions. It looks like almost everyone has responded. We'll leave it up another 5 seconds.
That's fine. Yeah, I'd be curious to see what this looks like. There's a lot of different reasons in the market right now to grow.
All right, here you go.
Grow existing market share. That's interesting. And then product diversification is the second one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sounds consistent with what we're seeing right now. There's a lot of consolidation of existing businesses, going after new markets, and There's a lot of pressure in terms of how to get that done. So we can talk a little bit about that. Whoops. Did I go too far? Sorry about that. All right, let's get into the next step here.
Sure. And so as we think about the integration planning process, there really are three essential elements to it: the growth strategy, the functional planning, and then the actual integration governance. When we talk about the growth strategy, again, that's the M&A strategy and the synergies. Some of the questions that we look to answer are, where will we play? With the combined entity, what markets, what customer segments, where are we going to focus our go-to-market efforts? The next 2 points, how we win and the capabilities, to me, these kind of come together. So in order to address the markets that we've identified in the where will we play, we need to talk about how are we going to compete and win. So whether that's price, I'll say product diversity and availability, to product quality, to service, even down to technical expertise. And in order to compete in that fashion, what are the capabilities that we need to have in place in order to do that? Just as a side note, we had a client who was developing their growth strategy, and they were introducing a new product to market, and one of their biggest, let's say, investments was going to be around this entire area of R&D and beginning to demonstrate technical expertise that they could then use with their distributors and prove that they are the experts in this new product that would affect the agriculture industry. And so that was a key priority for them. Away from that example, and then the last is in terms of aligning the integration plan, this really speaks to what are the priorities in timing during integration, and specifically what are the sequence of activities to achieve synergies and to integrate the operations. When we look at functional planning, for the integration, there's an upfront definition of what's in scope versus what's out of scope, i.e., we're going to merge two finance organizations. Look, we're not going to touch the target finance operation. We're going to consolidate their financials differently, but let them continue to operate. So therefore, it would be one of those out-of-scope items. What are the critical dependencies? And dependencies is one of those words, along with execution and IMO, that I want to come back to in future slides. But the one takeaway here is dependencies is one of those key areas that is critical for success. And then major milestones and then the cost are the other elements of functional planning. And then last is the governance, and really being planful about not only who owns decisions, how are we going to escalate issues and make decisions, how do we monitor the results, how do we maintain visibility both within the functional teams and then the steering committee. I'm tipping my hat a bit in terms of governance, and then ensuring that we also see the visibility to how is the integration performing from both an operational and a financial perspective. Aaron, can you go to the next slide? So what I'd like to do is sort of drill in a little bit more about the key elements behind a successful integration. And that first box, obviously, you've heard Aaron and I reference it 4 or 5 times. We have a firm belief that a successful integration stems from, is based on, and ties back to the M&A strategy. So that's why we're being repetitive. Again, where to play, how to win, what are the value drivers. But this next point is one that we haven't talked about, which is aligning the operating models. And to demystify this, the reality is that both businesses operate differently. They communicate differently, make decisions differently, have different levels of authority. They'll have different philosophies on the use of full-time resources versus temporary, the use of contractors, even down to what's insourced and outsourced, and what's insourced and outsourced. So the activity that occurs here is really beginning to think through, what do we want the operating model to look like going forward post-close? Meaning, is the target simply going to 100% adapt to the operating model of the buyer? Or are there certain things in there that might make sense for the combined entity that require a modification of the operating model? All of these things are thought through in detail. And the reason is that if you don't think about those things, then when you start working through integration and getting your teams involved, they've got a probability of going off track. So specifically, aligning plans that don't line up with maybe what the operating model should be. So moving from strategy, we get to what's called the functional charters. And this is really we're working in sort of a narrowing level of detail. The charters provide an overview of function by function, what are the objectives and scope in the integration? What are the key things that have to be in place for day one? Great example in finance, want to make sure that the right signatures are on the banking accounts, and we don't have cash being undepositable, or God forbid, even worse, we can't pay payroll on day one. So those are key ones out of the finance area. And then also some decisions required, risks identified, and once again, that key word, critical dependencies. Let me give you an example maybe to bring this to light. Think about a transaction where one of the key assumptions is that there's an ability to really improve our gross margin through improvements within the supply chain. Let's say 3 points of gross margin benefit. That would obviously be part of the charter. It would be a priority point for the integration moving forward. And the key, though, is that those kinds of changes don't just happen within the supply chain. You might need significant systems changes from IT. You might need analytical support from finance. Those are effectively dependencies that you need in order to keep that initiative going. They're flagged here in the charters, and then when we look to the right toward the day one and post day one, the major milestones, they're present both in the supply chain milestones as well as the IT. And that way, those other functions that have their own integration plans can see the priority points of, well, we need to make sure that we deal with the supply chain requirements first because that's driving the most value, and they can sequence their resources and plans to meet that need. Going into a bit more detail on the work plans, this is where, again, it is somewhat high level. This is actually the detailed ones, apologies. This is where function by function, we're laying out, here are the initiatives, here are the specific tasks within each initiative, the owner, the start finish date, and then any kind of assumed one-time cost. It will lay out the critical path for the functional integration, and again, that drive toward moving very quickly and identifying those opportunities to accelerate the plan at a functional level. One step to the right, the Milestone Roadmap is really, I call it a roll-up of the detailed work plans. And this is something that the senior management and the integration office would use to plan the integration, to update on the status, what's on track versus off, and to coordinate major activities. Personally, I think the Milestone Roadmap is really the first clean look that the executive team will have to start to get ahead of dependencies. In what we've seen both in clients and then in our prior experience, you run the risk of developing fantastic plans and everything goes through IT or everything goes through finance. And unfortunately, the old rule of thumb is it's the same 10, 15 resources doing everything. And so this is really the place where, and it can be a little manual, it can be a little tough, but it's the place where you can get very strategic about what resources do we have, what is the best use of their time, do I use contractors or not, or do I stagger certain initiatives? Again, without recognizing those dependencies on other areas and resources, that's one of those biggest risks that we've seen that creates failure. Everyone wants to do something, and there's a bottleneck.
And how do we get there? Yeah, so how do we go about doing that? So this is what we call the plan for the plan. And so that milestone plan that Dave just finished up with, that is one that we commonly, once we all agree to it, we'll actually print it out, put it on the wall, and make sure it never moves. That way it's really difficult to move a milestone when somebody's ahead or behind schedule. And that's tongue-in-cheek, but it is real in terms of, in order for the strategy to become real, the ability to enable capabilities, putting the right systems and processes in place depend on that master plan. Now, how do we go about getting there? So developing the master plan is really a lot of art and a little bit of science, but it's really deliberate. There's going to be, you typically want to have an integration management office, which we'll talk about in a moment. And this is the kind of the central function. This keeps all the teams coordinated on the master plan of how we're going to do the planning and execution of the integration. They will commonly help, with the kickoff, set the strategy. This is with both companies, representatives from both companies in terms of what we're going to do with this business once we acquire it, how the operating model is going to be shifted, what the overall financial and customer experience strategy is going to be. So everybody clearly understands how that's going to work. Everybody will take that information and start going through the charters that David explained, identifying what's required for day one, what's going to be required right after day one, and how that's all going to, come together as one plan. You'll see in week 3, we commonly go through an exercise, what we call walk the walls. And what that is, it's basically a work stream by work stream, an explanation of what the next 6 months is going to look like. Finance is going to do these activities from right out of the gate, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. IT, finance, supply chain, go-to-market, R&D, all of them will have their step plan that looks similar to this one, and you'll see the linkages with the arrows that say, if in order for this to happen, these other 3 things have to also happen. And if one doesn't make it, then the whole thing has to slide. And that's the master, and that's why you have to have that master plan, so you know exactly what the issues are that are going to cause delays and how you're going to remediate those things. And then also, we'll go through a day 1 readiness check to make sure we actually have everything in place. Now, the functional teams are going to start looking at their plans and say, okay, how do I actually do this at a function level? There's a lot of cross-dependency, a lot of joint meetings in terms of, I want to go to market with this new message, and I need a website updated, I need some new tools, IT, finance, everybody's involved with that. So this is why it takes this much time to actually get all the plans put in place, agree about what's in scope, what's out of scope, what's required for day 1, what's required for post day 1. 2 other really important elements on here are the communications plan, which I'll touch on in more detail in a moment. But you have to be super deliberate in terms of how you're coming up with your master narrative. Why are you doing this? How is the market going to receive it? How are the growers going to receive it? How are your vendors and suppliers going to receive it? And most importantly, how are your employees going to receive it? The lack of this is going to cause a lot of problems because your managers who are being empowered to actually put the integration plan together, if they don't have a narrative, they will make one up because they get a lot of pressure to do this. And this is where one of the other breakdowns happens, is making sure we have a clear communication strategy. And then with regard to employees, this is extremely important in terms of you've got a whole new set of managers, senior managers, some staff coming into the company. You need to be deliberate in terms of what is the culture like? Is it a matrix organization? Is it top down? How are decisions made? It could be the same, could be very different than the way you do things. And these are the little salient things that can really take your integration program off to the side if you're not being careful in terms of how you're managing your employees' expectations. So we list out how are they going to be communicated with, how often are they going to be updated. If we don't have information, just be clear about that. We don't know, but this is when we expect to know, and this is when we're going to have an announcement on this. And then there's the tactical steps in terms of making sure that we have emails set up for everybody. We do have an onboarding process and package for people to get onboarded to the company. We'll do the background checks, everything in advance of day 1. And so there's a lot of activity going on in this process. And again, there's a lot of major deliverables coming out of here that will set the path going forward so everybody understands how this is going to work. Now, I mentioned the day 1 and post-close, and so just to clarify, these are things like getting the transaction closed, there are conditions to close, there's legal transactions, there's financial things going on. There might be some novations you have to put in place to bring contracts over because there's change of ownership clauses in there. So a lot of these details are part of your diligence and your early integration planning so that these things are in place on day 1 and there's no disruption. Our goal here is to make sure that you're turning the key on day 1, no slowdown in customer interactivity. There's no slowdown in transaction processing. Everybody knows what they're doing, how they're going to do this. So day 1, there's a real focus on making sure we get that right. This is your first impression to the market, your first impression to the new employees. You want to make sure you have this in place and have a clear plan post-close. And again, on post-close, it's how are we going to market? How are we going to win with the new capabilities that we have? How do we tap into all the special things about the target that we like? How do we exploit those to the benefit of the broader company and really take advantage of some of these opportunities? So this is where we come back to the emphasis on we define the synergies up front, we did the math, it works on paper. How do we actually make it work in practice? What's the timeline? Who's responsible for it? What kind of one-time costs are involved with it? And how do we actually start measuring and tracking that in our financial systems so we can start reporting against that? How do we do some early integration of the ERPs and the CRMs and the HR systems? Some may go away, some may stay. We commonly see, especially in the fall time frame, consolidation of HR right away, because we got new plans coming in place starting January 1st. So start tying it into your normal business practice and your time cycles. IT is going to be the one that's probably most critical. It's going to affect most functions completely. Everybody needs to have access. They need computers. They need security. Data is a big element of this. So there's probably more hinging on IT than any other function. They are the greatest enabler of synergies, putting systems and helping processes work well so they can achieve those synergies. But they also have a lot of work to do on themselves in terms of getting a network and security and those kinds of things in place. And then, as I said, on the HR side, there's a lot to do with where are my benefits? How do I get a paycheck? How do I think about my vacation time? What are we doing with that? Am I getting it paid out? Can I still use it? A lot of tactical decisions around this. So we want to make sure we have answers for all of those things. So you can kind of see day one, making sure we can look and act and feel like one operating company starting day one. We've got all the mechanics put together so we can actually move the business forward. But then post-close, how do we execute on that strategy and drive the value out of it? Another critical piece I just mentioned about the communications, and I'm not going to drain this slide, but it's to illustrate that there's a lot of activity that goes into developing the master narrative, as I mentioned before. Why are we doing this? How does it benefit your customers? How does it benefit your growers? How does it benefit the employees? All have to be real and tangible, and they need to be consistent more than anything else. And I'm talking from the person who maybe takes a phone call. It's the entry-level staff. Do they know what to say when a customer calls and says, why are you guys doing this? You want to make sure everybody understands exactly what needs to be said and that we are executing against that completely. And there's all forms of communications. There might be emails, there might be advertisements, especially on day one. You got to think about the logistics. Who's going to be physically in what locations? And what are we going to say? Are we going to have a little bit of a party right after that? Are we going to have a town hall? Are we going to do something for the community, 30 days out? All of these things need to be thought about and planned for well in advance, because there's a lot of coordination, but more importantly, it's got to tie back again, strategy, narrative, execution. So these are the really, pretty important components of this. So let's just talk a little bit about the governance and how this actually works.
Aaron, before we go to governance, can I just add one thing to the prior slide? Just to hit home a point, Aaron and I have seen this with a prior client. The reality is, once the transaction's announced, let's be honest, your competitors are going to come after your customers, your growers, your distributors. They're going to be basically shifting the narrative in terms of why is this deal a bad thing for them? And so that's why this key messaging up front, so there's absolute clarity with your customer base, with your sales team is echoing the same message, et cetera, is really important. And so we've seen that instance, and then same thing on the employee side. We have an instance where with one of our clients, their COO has designated himself as the chief culture officer, and literally pre-close, he's talking with the target about why does the buyer do things the way they do, and also throughout the transaction hearing, well, what are the concerns that people have? Because the reality is, if you're buying this business for capabilities, you're buying it for people. And so to the extent that you can jumpstart that cultural meld, the better off you are. That sometimes we hear that's the soft stuff. That's the stuff that will actually derail you. There you go.
Excellent points, Dave. Thanks.
Sure. All right. Integration governance. So when Aaron and I talk about governance, we're really talking about execution. And this is the structure for ensuring, I'd say, flawless execution. There are 3 levels to governance: the steering committee, the integration management office, and the functional teams. And while they have different roles and responsibilities, the reality is they're all driven from the same goal and mindset, which is relentless focus on executing the integration and achieving the synergies and the integration goals behind the deal. So with that said, let's go into a little more detail on each role. The steering committee. So typically, it's a small group. We'll see the COO, CFO from both the buyer and the seller. Maybe you'd have a chief sales and marketing officer as well, but real small group, very senior, and they're the stewards for the integration. They get the readouts from the teams and from the integration office. Their real goal, though, is when there are issues requiring executive intervention, they weigh in very quickly, make the decisions, and keep the teams moving. So clearing obstacles, making decisions, and then providing guidance when teams might just be drifting off of what their critical path is. And then again, monitoring the overall progress of the integration and communicating that up and down the organization. Let's go to the next one. All right, the Integration Management Office, and this just is one of those key positions. And before I go into the roles and responsibilities, just a bit of context. We feel that this is probably one of the most significant positions in the actual deal itself. This is not the typical person you might pluck out of a functional area who's a project manager and have them run this. The skill set is this person has, I'd say, broad knowledge of the business, broad understanding of what is the organization trying to do through the integration, and the ability to focus at a very detailed level to unlock functional teams that might be stuck, and yet keep them moving forward to focus on, let's say, the main thing, rather than getting hung up on very small details or challenges that frankly aren't going to help you achieve the integration. So this ability to go up and down in detail, keep things moving, and then also being a real partner with the executive team and making sure that their needs are met as well in terms of what questions are they getting from the CEO, from the board, and being able to answer those. So one of our pieces of advice is, while we talked about dependencies as being critical, selecting your integration management lead is a very significant decision. And we would recommend that just make sure you've got someone who's got that broad base of skills along with the organizational skills. So in terms of their day-to-day work, they do oversee the integration progress. The cadence and the way they work is on a weekly basis, they'll be meeting with the functional teams to identify issues and status, what things are on track versus off. There might be a second, I'll call it functional leader discussion. So this is, let's bring them all together and talk about what dependencies are going on, where are there issues across teams, and how do we manage those? And then last but not least, updating the master plan, tracking what's going on in terms of being on track versus off in timing, and then red flagging any costs that are beginning to show up that weren't planned, costs that are basically outside of what was projected. And then the last group is actually the functional teams themselves. So typically, this will be, I'll call them manager levels and decision makers within the functional areas from both the buyer and the seller, with folks below them to drive the analytics and whatnot. But they are actively engaged and involved. They own the actual integration for that area. So whatever the goal and objective is for marketing, they are driving what changes to the business need to occur, along what timeline and at what cost. They will also be responsible for reporting up to the Integration Management Office and updates on milestones. And this really is, this is where the work is done. You're turning, very talented folks loose who are decision makers, who have a vision for how their function should operate within the assumptions of the business case, and they're driving forward and making it happen. All right. So one thing, before we leave governance, the one thing we want to share with you is again, there's a bit of more detail in terms of roles and responsibilities. And one of the ones I want to focus you on is that steering committee setting the agenda for the CEO and for board coordination. Obviously, that's something that sometimes gets missed. It becomes a flurry of activity of how do we communicate with the board or the CEO on a regular basis, and decks are generated and all the rest. This really is where the steering group can be, again, planful in what is the cadence, how do we keep those key folks informed of the status of the integration, or other groups that might be outside of your organization. So on average, though, from a time perspective, we've seen this, the Integration Steering Committee, typically 5% time commitment. I'd say in our past, once a month in terms of meetings is a pretty regular cadence. The IMO, 15 to 20+% on a daily basis is their commitment. And then your integration team leads, they're 80% dedicated to this work. And here is one of the needles to thread, which is these are the same folks, frankly, who are responsible for running the business as well as integrating the business. And so they are also the ones that can resource this effectively, shuffle roles and responsibilities so that that train of running the business continues while we're making changes to the business and integrating the target.
One thing that I'll add to this as well is that I see this probably more in agriculture than other industries, is that a lot of the founders, owners, family businesses that are in the agriculture business, the model is much different than what we're describing here, meaning that a lot of the decisions are made by, a handful of folks in the company. And integrations require everybody to be involved and to be empowered to actually make decisions and design their function most effectively. And this is why, as we talked about the integration management office, it needs to be done individually, but also brought back up and looked at collectively, and then raised back up to the steering and say, okay, does this still align with our objectives on the strategy? And this is something I find very unique and something you want to really think about. The people that you put on the program as leaders, this cannot be a part-time role with the sense that they're busy all the time and can't think strategically about the integration. This has a direct impact in terms of how you can deliver those capabilities and achieve the strategies you have laid out for yourselves. So keep that in mind. It's something that we commonly see. It's a struggle for some of for some of the leaders, frankly, with taking on that much responsibility when they have been asked to do that in the past. So just a lesson learned there. Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about the next question here, Amy.
All right, so our third polling question is, how confident are you in your execution capabilities? A, we have a history of successfully executing strategic projects. B, we have great intentions, but sometimes lack execution. Or C, we have limited capacity to handle another major project.
This is something we struggle with.
Sorry about that. And while you're answering, if you would like a copy of today's slides with all of this information, you can download it from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. And then we also send them via email tomorrow along with a recording of this webcast. All right, here are the results.
Limited capacity, maybe a little bit lacking execution, and a fair amount of almost pretty evenly split across the board here in terms of being successful. Kind of what I would expect to see. And, there's always the challenge of, do we have enough time in the day to get everything done? Because this is an and question. We have to service our customers, take care of our people, and we have to integrate another business that could be as equal size as to what we already are. So this is a common constraint, common struggle. Very important to kind of define what that strategy looks like up front and be realistic about exactly what you can do internally, and because that'll only benefit you in the long run. All right, let's just go through a simple case study here. This is a program that we helped the client out with. This happened to be a carve out, but this probably took 12 to 18 months to come to maturity. It started out, as we mentioned before, with really identifying the gap they had in the portfolio, right? And it was a little bit of an opportunistic transaction, but it also was aligned completely to what they thought they needed to address some market gaps. And we went through an offsite study. We had the chairman and executive owners and everyone else that needed to be there and really talk through, how does this business fit into our overall strategy? Looking at the suppliers, the growers, the market opportunities, every aspect of this. We looked at it over probably a 3-day on a weekend, just really ironing this thing out. Came out of there with a clear objective, came out of there with some challenge goals in terms of synergies. How do we take costs out, make processes more efficient, especially in the operations? And then how do we grow the pie, in these new markets? And then through that, you kind of identify the leaders who are going to be most likely leading the program, and we identified those folks and started preparing them in terms of how to run the integration process. And that was really important first step of getting that pre-sign, let's make sure we understand this and test it, really challenge our thinking around there so that we're not caught off guard later. And look, you're never going to get 100% of this right. That's why I say keep pushing, keep challenging, keep trying to prove or disprove your thesis around this. It'll only get you in a better spot. There's going to be things that you can't anticipate that are going to happen. And so you're just trying to make sure that you've got the right questions asked early on. You've got the rigor around the governance, so that if issues come up, it just gets dropped in. It's another issue, we manage it, et cetera. Now, in this case here, sign to close, we spent a lot of time being very aggressive about those charters. What's actually in scope? What's out of scope? The master plan, we must have reviewed that 100 times just to make sure everything lined up perfectly. Realistic about certain, capacity levels for individuals. Another unique thing about the ag industry is the cycle in terms of, when are people available? You have busy seasons where you're knocked out for 3 months, 6 months out of the year, and this doesn't always line up correctly. So how much can you do now? How much can you defer? And those are all decisions we need to make. Sign to close. So really focusing in on what can we accomplish, what needs to be put in place for day one, really emphasize the communications because it was a big impact to the community, as well as all the people involved. The third piece of this was really business continuity. How do we ensure that we can maintain the business, the volume of product that we need to have? How do we prioritize what we think are the highest priority issues? And then putting in place the right operating model. Now, I want to underscore this point in terms of the operating model needs to be really enabling the business strategy and the capabilities we talked about. And then you look at the people and determine, do we have the right people can actually execute against that? What we commonly see is companies putting people together and say, okay, well, I like Dave in this position and Aaron in this position. Whether they're capable or not, it almost becomes a second thought. So you have to be very careful in terms of how you put the business together, know that that's going to drive the growth, consolidate the cost, the operations, but do you have the right leadership in place to be able to execute against that? Super important. In this case here, we had transition agreements. And what this means is when you're carving out a business, the parent company of the other business that you're buying may have to continue to provide IT services, HR services, accounting services. And so we had to go through a process of defining exactly what needed to be covered and for what price. And that's another negotiation point in terms of just getting the deal closed. So really important to get that in place. And then long term, how do you go about achieving these things? So we had the master plan, literally put it on the wall, weekly, governance discussions around, are we on track or off track? If we're off track, what milestone? What milestone is impacting other milestones? So we can make the right decisions to make sure it gets back on track. Relentless focus on the customer. How do we make sure they're empowered with, more capabilities from the company? How are they kept informed? How do they become closer as a partner? Making this, transaction more accretive overall. And the last couple of items were just really around continued expansion of the market. There's a lot of opportunity. In this case here, they brought some new capabilities they didn't have before, some new products. Really was exciting in terms of where their geographic spread, resulted in, and then, as well as the logistics capabilities. So again, this was probably a 12, 18 month. It was 18 months to get the whole plan put in place. It was 12 months of really dedicated time to put this all in place and execute it perfectly. And they're achieving, a lot of the results that they're expected to achieve. All right, let's see. What do we have here? Another polling question.
All right, so the last polling question is, are you considering a sale of the company? A, yes, within the next 2 years. B, yes, already engaged an investment bank. C, maybe, have been approached. Or D, considering a succession exit. And once you've completed all of your CPE requirements, you can download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE progress window right in your console. Do another 5 seconds.
All right.
Okay, here are the results.
I was going to put my money on succession exits. We are seeing this quite a lot in the market right now. I commonly get asked, where is the market today? Is it ripe? We're seeing a lot of private equity get into ag businesses. Tech-enabled agribusinesses are very hot right now. I think we're seeing a lot of the boomer generation who are looking to retire, to move on. Maybe the family wants to take the business on, maybe they don't. It's a lot of deep discussions around how to think about the business going forward. And I'm not surprised that a number of folks have already been approached. This is a market that we're predicting right now over the next couple of years is going to continue to consolidate, but there's going to be different types of buyers in place. It may not be the same ones that own the business today.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing more of the financial buyers coming into this space and making their presence felt.
Yep. So let me just wrap up on a couple of points, and maybe we'll have a couple of minutes for some questions. But here's what's really important. One, you have to make sure you're relying on the business case to drive the transaction. We talked about it from almost the first slide. Having that strategy and knowing that that's what you're trying to achieve, and you have to make sure you can keep going back to that and relying on that as a source, a governing, a guiding principle to make sure you're on the right track. If you get this part right, the rest of it will kind of fall into place. But if you don't, and you start getting kind of in different directions, it's going to not turn out that well. The master plan, I would say, is also extremely important. We talked about what's needed for day one, what's needed for post-close. Having the plan in place will give a lot of comfort to all the employees on both sides of the business. It'll help put at ease your customers, your vendors, your growers, so they know exactly what's going to transpire and by when and with whom. Being very clear about how that plan is going to work and the accountability will put you in a much better position. The third point I mentioned earlier is around empowering your team. Again, you're going to be putting folks in a lot different roles than they ever had before. They're going to have to make some really difficult decisions. They're going to have to take the ownership of decisions that impact cost, impact people, impact the relationship you might have with various constituents. So they need to be empowered and supported. Again, you're not going to get everything right, so you got to make sure you can flow and be agile to get through this. The governance structure, I know we've underscored this a number of times. It's extremely important to have a highly effective structure in place so that people know where to take issues. There's a central office that can actually start getting the information collected and pushing answers back out immediately. More importantly, that we have an escalation method of getting up to a steering committee to make the really tough calls on a small amount of issues. Steering committees are not designed to handle day-to-day issues, weekly issues. These are very strategic decisions that need to be made. That's why you're escalating it up to your executive steering committee. And then over-communicate. This is, again, commonly, and like all relationships, if you don't have good communication, you're going to have breakdowns. And there's an art to it. There's a science to it. You just need to make sure you have that master narrative put together. Everybody's empowered with notes, bullet points, full-on scripts. Every avenue of communication is being exploited to make sure that everybody understands why we're doing this. So if you get these elements right, you're probably going to be on a much better path than other companies. And we've seen that prove successful in other transactions. Yeah. So, Amy, I know we only have about a minute. Were there any other questions that we should try to address real quickly?
Unfortunately, we should probably close out unless you see one that you can address in 30 seconds or so.
No, I think we'll try to be efficient with everybody's time, so let's keep it to the time. Let's close it out.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Aaron and David, for a great presentation today. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, if you met all CPE requirements, you can download your certificate now from your console. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. And then as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.